Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very relatable, alcohol. Or more specifically, the strange joy of stepping into a medieval tavern, which it turns out was far weirder than most of us could ever imagine. So, before you settle in, maybe grab a warm drink, preferably one that doesn't involve any questionable 14th century brewing techniques. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It is evening in a medieval town, and the streets are settling into that peculiar hush that happens when the day's commerce is done, but before the night has truly begun. The sun has slipped low behind the timbered roofs, leaving a soft amber glow clinging to the cobblestones. In the air there is a faint smell of wood smoke, animal dung, and something vaguely sour, the unofficial perfume of the Middle Ages. Somewhere nearby, a lute is being tuned, badly. You are on your way to the tavern, not the noble's great hall or a respectable merchant's home, but the public house, the gathering place for locals, travelers, and anyone with enough coins or charm to get served. In our modern minds, we may imagine a cozy pub with cheerful bartenders and polished wooden counters. The medieval version is different. For one, the floor is dirt, real dirt, and if you're unlucky, it's also damp. The furniture is mismatched, not in a curated vintage way, but in the "this bench was stolen from a neighbor's pig shed" way. The door, when you push it open, gives a reluctant groan. Inside, the air is thicker than outside. This is partly due to the smoke from the central hearth, which has no chimney to speak of, and partly due to the fact that at least 36 people are crowded into a space meant for maybe half that number. They are laughing, shouting, spitting, and drinking from heavy wooden mugs that have probably not been washed since they were made. You may think that's unhygienic, and you're right, but keep in mind that in a world where most water could make you ill, beer was often the safer option. Speaking of beer, the stuff you're handed is not the cold, bubbly drink of today. It's warm, cloudy, and tastes faintly of bread and grass. This is ale, unfiltered, uncarbonated, and brewed by someone whose recipe is equal parts tradition and guesswork. If you have the coin for wine, it will arrive in a clay cup, perhaps sweetened with honey if the tavern keeper is feeling generous, or watered down if he isn't. In one corner, a pair of traveling merchants are engaged in a quiet but intense dice game. In another, a group of laborers are singing something that could be a drinking song or just an argument set to music. It's hard to tell. Near the hearth, a storyteller has gathered a small audience, spinning a tale about a knight, a dragon, and a beautiful maiden. The tale has taken on a bawdy twist, which earns both laughter and scandalized gasps. There is food of a sort. A pot simmers over the fire, filled with a stew that could contain mutton, cabbage, barley, or any number of unidentifiable lumps. Bread is plentiful, though often stale. Cheese is common too, firm, salty, and comforting in its familiarity. The smells from the food mingle with the smells from the people, and the overall effect is memorable. The tavern is not just a place to drink. It is the medieval version of a community center. Here, news is traded, deals are made, marriages are arranged, and occasional fistfights break out over matters as trivial as who insulted whose chicken. It is noisy, it is imperfect, and it is, for many, the most exciting part of their week. You find yourself a spot at a bench, your back to the wall, because you've heard that's the safest place to sit. The cup in your hand is heavy, the firelight flickers, and the voices around you blend into a kind of low, chaotic music. This is the medieval tavern, smoky, crowded, and alive. A medieval tavern door was not so much an invitation as it was a challenge. Heavy oak planks bound with iron bands, swollen from years of damp weather, were more than capable of bruising the shin of anyone foolish enough to let it swing back. And when it did open, the rush of warm, yeasty, human-scented air that hit you was less welcome and more brace yourself. Stepping inside, you didn't so much enter as commit. The light was dim, not in a cozy, candlelit way that modern restaurants aim for, but in the someone's trying to conserve tallow sort of way. Candles were expensive, firewood even more so. A single guttering flame might be doing the work of an entire chandelier, which meant that you could just about see the outline of someone sitting opposite you, but not enough to be entirely sure whether they were smiling or baring their teeth. And then there were the regulars, the so-called welcoming committee. Not the official staff, mind you, Tavern keepers rarely bothered with formal greeters. The task was handled informally by whichever group of patrons had already claimed the warmest spot by the hearth and were deep enough into their ale to think they were ambassadors of good cheer. Their approach could range from a hearty slap on the back, which might dislodge a lung if they were wearing gauntlets, to a slow, suspicious stare that silently asked, "What's your business here? And how much coin have you brought?" In many ways, a medieval tavern was less like a modern bar and more like a local family's living room, one where you were constantly at risk of being mistaken for someone's cousin, debtor, or rival. If you were a stranger, you might be asked where you were from. This was not small talk. This was interrogation. Your answer could determine whether you were offered a drink or subtly encouraged to leave. Local rivalries ran deep, and being from the next village over might be enough to get you served last, or not at all. And if you were a traveling merchant or a weary pilgrim, well, then you became entertainment. The regulars would lean in close, eager to hear your tales, while simultaneously assessing whether your coin purse looked heavy enough to justify their interest. Many a tired traveler learned too late that buying a round for the room was less a gesture of generosity and more a survival tactic. Of course, the tavern keeper, often a broad-shouldered figure with an uncanny ability to pour ale, break up fights, and keep an eye on the door all at once, was the true gatekeeper. They might greet you with a curt nod, a muttered word, or nothing at all. In their world, words were as valuable as drink, and neither were handed out lightly. The keeper's approval mattered more than you realized. A friendly nod might secure you a decent seat, a clean tankard, and maybe even a slice of something vaguely edible from the kitchen. A cold glance could relegate you to a drafty bench in the corner, where the wind found its way in and the floor sloped just enough for spilled ale to trickle toward your boots. Then there were the smells, because the medieval tavern did not care about your delicate modern sensibilities. Smoke from the hearth clung to everything, mingling with the tang of sour ale, the dampness of wool cloaks, and the unmistakable aroma of people who considered bathing a seasonal activity. Add to this the occasional whiff of roasted meat, or something pretending to be meat, and you had an atmosphere that was less quaint and more potent. Conversation filled the room, but it was rarely polite. Instead of gentle murmurs, you got a rolling wave of sound. The slap of tankards on wooden tables, bursts of rough laughter, the occasional shouted insult, and the distinctive sound of dice skittering across a board. Games of chance were the heartbeat of the tavern. They could start with friendly wagers and end with someone threatening to run another man through with a dagger, all in the space of a single evening. If you were unlucky, you might find yourself sitting too close to the bard. This was not always a bad thing. A skilled musician could lift spirits, smooth over arguments, and make the ale flow faster. But a less skilled one, say a fellow who knew only 3 songs and played all of them badly, could turn your night into an endurance trial. And there was no polite way to move without making it obvious. Seating was another gamble. The good spots by the fire were taken before you even arrived. These were occupied by the regulars, men and women who had sat in the same seats for so long that the wood bore the imprint of their posteriors. You, as the newcomer, might be stuck near the door, where every blast of cold air reminded you that your cloak was still damp. And yet, for all its chaos, there was a strange sort of comfort to the medieval tavern. It was the beating heart of the community, a place where news was traded, deals were struck, and grudges were both born and resolved. It was loud, smelly, and often dangerous, but it was also warm, alive, and endlessly fascinating. You didn't come here for peace and quiet. You came here to be reminded that the world was full of stories. Some you might overhear, some you might tell, and some you might accidentally become part of. If you stayed long enough, the initial stares would fade. Someone would slide a tankard your way. You'd be invited to join a game, or a song, or a conversation about how the local miller's new apprentice was clearly cursed, and slowly, without realizing it, you'd find yourself leaning back on your bench, loosening your cloak, and letting the smoky warmth soak into your bones. Because in the medieval world, a tavern wasn't just a place to drink. It was a place to be, for better or worse, whether you wanted to or not. If you've ever walked into a modern pub, you might expect the gentle mingling of beer, fried food, and maybe the faint whiff of a citrus cleaning spray that pretends the floor is cleaner than it really is. A medieval tavern offered something else. The first thing to hit you would not be the sight of people or even the sound of chatter. It would be the smell. It was not a single smell. It was layers. Imagine stale ale that has seeped into the wooden floorboards for decades. Imagine smoke from a constantly burning fire that has clung to every beam, every table, every strand of hair in the room. Imagine sweat, not just from the patrons, but from the animals sometimes brought inside to keep warm. Add to that the aroma of medieval hygiene standards, which is to say, a complete lack of them. And finally, somewhere in that heady bouquet, the faint sweetness of honeyed mead or spiced wine trying desperately to make itself noticed. No scented candles, no air fresheners. The air was heavy, lived in, unapologetic. And strangely, it was part of the charm. The entrance ritual. Doors, if the tavern even had them, did little to keep the smell contained. Many were just heavy cloth hangings or crude wooden planks that swung open with a groan. You would step inside and immediately feel the temperature change, not because of a heating system, but because dozens of bodies, a roaring fire, and a low ceiling had turned the room into a slow-cooking pot of humanity. The light was dim. Firelight and tallow candles did their best to illuminate the place, casting everything in a warm, flickering haze. Shadows danced on the walls, making the already loud room feel alive in strange, unpredictable ways. Someone would notice you, they always noticed newcomers. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was suspicion, or maybe it was the hope that you were carrying coin. A floor that told stories. The floor of a medieval tavern was not just a floor. It was a record of every spilled drink, every dropped morsel of food, every muddy footprint. Some were covered in straw to soak up the mess, which, when left too long, produced its own unique brand of atmosphere. You might hear the occasional crunch under your boots. Better not to think about what caused it. Sound without silence. The soundscape of a tavern was relentless. There was no soft background music, no curated playlist. Instead, there were bursts of laughter, the thud of mugs slamming onto tables, the scrape of stools, the clatter of dice or gaming pieces. And over it all, the low, constant hum of conversation, thick with accents, local gossip, and more than a few tall tales. If a bard was performing, his voice had to fight to be heard, competing against the sounds of drinking and living. And if someone got into an argument, well, that was part of the evening's entertainment too. The patrons, taverns were equalizers, the rare place where merchants, farmers, and the occasional noble slumming it might cross paths. Not that everyone mingled in perfect harmony. Groups stuck together, farmhands in one corner, tradesmen in another, sailors near the fire, and the innkeeper's regulars planted in the best seats as if they owned them. Clothing told you a lot about who was who, from the quality of the fabric to how many layers a person could afford. And yet, after enough drinks, those distinctions blurred. Ale did not care if you had silk on your back or wool scratchy against your skin. The goat problem. It's worth noting that in some rural taverns, livestock weren't kept outside, especially in cold weather. It wasn't unheard of for someone's goat to wander between tables, looking for crumbs. The animal didn't find this strange, and neither did most patrons. The smell, again. Yes, it comes back to the smell, because after a while you stopped noticing it, and that was when you knew you were part of the room. Your senses had adapted, and the tavern had claimed you. By the time you took a seat, you were no longer an outsider. The warmth, the noise, the flicker of light, and yes, that unforgettable aroma, had pulled you into a living piece of history. And, for the next few hours, it was your world. You've made it through the doorway. You've accepted the smell as your new reality. Now comes the main event, ordering something to drink. It sounds simple. It isn't. First, there's the fact that the medieval menu was rarely written down. Most taverns didn't have a menu at all, not in the way we understand it. If you wanted to know what they served, you had to ask, and hope the person answering didn't mumble into their beard. Second, drinks weren't standardized. There was no guarantee that what you got last week would be the same this week, or even the same hour. Brewing was part science, part witchcraft, and part complete accident. Ale, the staple of the medieval tavern. Ale was the backbone of the drinking culture, and no, it wasn't just beer without hops. It was often cloudy, unfiltered, and with a shelf life of a few days before it turned sour. It came in varying strengths, from the barely alcoholic small ale that even children drank, to the stronger brews that could knock a grown man sideways. The flavor? Let's say, it was honest, sometimes pleasantly malty, sometimes with a suspicious tang that suggested something had gone slightly wrong in the barrel. But people drank it anyway because water could be far more dangerous. Mead and wine. If you wanted something sweeter, you might order mead, fermented honey mixed with water and sometimes spiced for a hint of luxury. But mead was expensive, a treat for special occasions or for those with heavier purses. Wine was rarer still in the colder climates. In England, it often had to be imported, which made it costly. And by the time it arrived, it was sometimes halfway to becoming vinegar. But a clever tavern keeper could disguise this with spices, honey, or heat, giving rise to the warm, comforting tradition of mulled wine. Drinks you probably shouldn't order. Not everything on offer was advisable. You might see cider, perry, pear cider, or something called ale posset, which involved curdled milk and hot ale, a combination that, even then, divided opinion. There were also herbal infusions that claimed to cure ailments, though whether they cured anything besides thirst is debatable. And sometimes, frankly, you just didn't want to know what was in the cup. The serving ritual. You didn't get a glass bottle or even a clean cup every time. Drinks were served in wooden tankards, ceramic mugs, or pewter vessels, the latter giving your beverage a faint metallic tang. In poorer taverns, cups were shared, rinsed in a communal bucket of water, and sent back into circulation. The serving size varied wildly. There was no pint or half pint as a fixed measure. You got whatever vessel the tavern owned, which could be anything from a dainty cup to something resembling a small bucket. Paying for your drink. Payment could be made in coins, but bartering wasn't unheard of, especially in small villages. A chicken, a length of cloth, or a promise of labor might secure you a few mugs of ale. Regulars sometimes drank on credit, which created its own kind of tension if debts went unpaid. And there was always the innkeeper's watchful eye, a silent reminder that nothing in this smoky, warm, noisy little world was free. Drinking etiquette. In the medieval tavern, there were rules even if they weren't written down. If someone raised their mug to you, you were expected to return the gesture. If a stranger bought you a drink, you were expected to buy one back eventually. And if you spilled someone else's drink, well, you might be paying for it in more than just coin. Sharing was common. Passing a tankard around the table wasn't unusual, and neither was drinking from the same vessel as your neighbor. Germ theory wouldn't be invented for centuries, and no one seemed in a rush to get there. The slow slide into liveliness. The first drink was often quiet, a way to settle into the rhythm of the place. The second brought more conversation. By the third, the tavern was louder, warmer, and somehow even more alive. Stories got bigger, laughter got freer, dice rolled faster, and somewhere, in the corner, a bard's tune started to sound like the greatest song you'd ever heard. By the time you finished your drink, the outside world felt far away. The cold wind, the muddy roads, the long walk home, they didn't matter yet. You were in the tavern, and the night was still young. If drinking in a medieval tavern was a gamble, eating in one was, let's say, a bigger gamble with higher stakes. The idea of the tavern as a restaurant is a modern invention. In the Middle Ages, the food was an afterthought, sometimes an inspired afterthought, sometimes an unfortunate one. The menu, such as it was, there was no leather-bound book with gold-embossed lettering. There might not even be a chalkboard. Instead, food was whatever the tavern keeper had on hand, which meant whatever the market, the season, and the state of their pantry allowed. Some days you might get a hearty stew, thick with barley and root vegetables, perhaps with scraps of meat floating hopefully among them. Other days you might get bread hard, dense, and in need of dunking into ale just to be chewable. If the tavern was attached to an inn, you might find roasted meats, pies, and puddings. If not, you were more likely to get something humble, reheated from a pot that had been sitting on the hearth for hours or days. Pottage, the eternal stew. The king of tavern food was pottage, a thick, porridge-like mixture of grains, vegetables, and whatever meat could be spared. It was a dish that evolved over time, literally. Ingredients were added as they became available, and the pot was rarely emptied completely. This was the infamous perpetual stew, which could be kept going for weeks, even months. It was filling, it was warm, and it was almost impossible to know exactly what was in it. That was either a comfort or a concern, depending on your personality. Meat if you could afford it. Meat in a medieval tavern was not the neatly portioned affair we're used to. It might be rabbit, pigeon, salted beef, or, if you were in luck, fresh pork. Seasoning was more about preservation than flavor, with heavy use of salt to keep things from spoiling. Freshness was a sliding scale. In winter, meat could be stored longer. In summer, it had to be eaten quickly, or slowly transformed into something edible through boiling and spices. Fish days and fast days. Religion shaped the menu. On certain days, meat was forbidden, and fish became the centerpiece. In coastal towns, that might mean fresh herring or cod. Inland, it meant preserved fish, salted, dried, or even pickled, which had a flavor that lingered in the room long after the meal was done. Taverns adapted by offering fish pottage, fish pies, or fish fried in oil, though oil could mean anything from olive oil to rendered animal fat. Bread, the utensil you ate. Bread wasn't just food, it was also the plate. A chunk of coarse bread, called a trencher, would be used to hold your meal. By the end, it would be soaked with juices, and you could either eat it, give it to the poor, or feed it to the tavern dog. The bread's quality depended on the grain. Richer patrons might get fine white bread. Poorer customers may do with dark, dense loaves full of rye or barley. Flavor, medieval style. Spices were a mark of status. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper had to be imported and were worth their weight in gold. A well-spiced dish suggested wealth, or at least good connections. For the common tavern goer, flavor came from onions, leeks, garlic, and herbs grown locally. Sometimes vinegar was used to brighten a dish. Sometimes ale or wine was poured in for depth. And then there was the ever-present salt, the medieval answer to most culinary problems. Food safety or the lack thereof. No one in a medieval tavern had a thermometer. No one checked cooking times against health guidelines. Food was judged safe by sight, smell, and ultimately by whether the cook or the last customer was still alive. To mask any questionable freshness, taverns leaned heavily on spices, sauces, and cooking methods that killed most, but not all, of what might be living in the food. Eating with others. There were no private tables with polite distance between diners. You sat where there was space, elbow to elbow, sharing trenchers, knives, and sometimes even bites. Forks were rare. Most eating was done with fingers and a personal knife you brought from home. It was noisy, close, and inescapably communal. In a world where isolation was rare, eating was another way of being part of the crowd, whether you wanted to be or not. The atmosphere around a meal. Meals weren't rushed, but they weren't quiet either. While you ate, the air around you carried the sound of tankards clinking, dice rolling, a minstrel song drifting between tables. Occasionally, an argument flared up, only to be settled with laughter, or with someone being escorted outside. The food was there to fill your belly, but the tavern was there to fill your evening. By the time your trencher was empty, your mug refilled, and your fingers wiped on whatever passed for a napkin, you were warm, satisfied, and entirely part of the medieval tavern world, a place where the food might be humble, but the company was never dull. If a medieval tavern were just a place to sit quietly, sip ale, and go home, it would not have survived long. The real attraction, besides the drink, was the entertainment. And by entertainment, we don't mean polite chess games or poetry readings. We mean dice clattering on wood, coins changing hands, and the occasional fight breaking out over something that, in hindsight, was never worth fighting about. Dice, the oldest vice. The simplest game was also the most dangerous to your wallet. Dice games required no board, no cards, no elaborate setup. Just a pair of cubes, a table, and an appetite for risk. The rules varied wildly. Some games were about getting the highest roll. Others were about hitting a specific total. Most involved betting. And most ended with someone swearing the dice were loaded. Gambling was technically frowned upon, and sometimes banned by law, but that only seemed to make it more popular. The thrill of tossing the bones, the sound of them bouncing across the wood, the sudden gasp when someone rolled exactly what they needed, it was all part of the tavern's heartbeat. Tables and boards. For those who preferred a slower burn, there were board games. Backgammon's ancestor, known as tables, was a favorite. It had the same mix of luck and strategy, but with less shouting than dice games, unless someone accused you of cheating, which could happen at any moment. Checkers and early forms of chess were also known, though chess had an air of seriousness that didn't always fit with the tavern mood. It was better suited to noble halls, where players had the patience to think 3 moves ahead instead of 3 gulps ahead. Cards, when they arrived. Playing cards didn't appear in Europe until the late 14th century, and when they did, they spread like spilled wine. Cheap to make, easy to carry, and endlessly adaptable, they became another way to turn an evening into either triumph or regret. In the tavern, card games were loud, fast, and rarely stuck to official rules. The goal was less about honorable play and more about winning enough to buy the next round, or at least not losing your shirt. Wagers beyond the table. Not all gambling involved dice or cards. Tavern goers would bet on anything. Who could drink the fastest? Who could hold a note the longest in a song? Which rat would win in a scuffle by the hearth? It wasn't dignified, but it passed the time. And if you were unlucky enough to lose, you paid up, usually in coin, sometimes in drinks, and occasionally in humiliation. Music and storytelling. Not all entertainment was competitive. Taverns often had a resident musician or minstrel, paid partly in coin, partly in ale, and partly in the warm feeling of having a place to play. Songs ranged from romantic ballads to bawdy tunes, with the crowd often joining in whether they knew the words or not. Storytellers would also command the room, spinning tales of knights, saints, and the occasional ghost who haunted a nearby road. The performance was rarely uninterrupted. Someone always dropped a mug or shouted across the room, but it was enough to make the tavern feel alive. Dancing, space permitting. If the room was big enough, dancing might break out. Not the polished court dances of noble halls, but lively, stamping, spinning affairs that had more enthusiasm than technique. Sometimes a table would be cleared to make space. Sometimes people just danced in the space they had, weaving between benches and nearly tripping over the dog. Rowdiness and risk. Entertainment in a medieval tavern carried a certain unpredictability. The same game that began with laughter could end with an overturned table. A friendly bet could sour into an accusation of cheating. And because most people carried knives, disputes had to be settled quickly, preferably before blood was spilled. Many taverns had their own way of handling trouble. The offending party was either thrown out into the street or made to buy the next round for the whole table, depending on the severity. Why it mattered. For the average medieval person, life was a cycle of work, church, and obligations. The tavern was one of the few spaces where you could loosen your belt, speak your mind, and risk a handful of coins on the roll of the dice. It wasn't just a place to drink. It was a place to test your luck, your skill, and your ability to laugh off losing. And if you left lighter in the purse but richer in stories, you had still won in some small way. If the tavern was the stage, then the tavern keeper was the director, producer, and occasionally bouncer all rolled into one. Running a medieval tavern was not a hobby. It was a demanding, exhausting, often unglamorous profession that required equal parts charm, toughness, and an ability to pretend you hadn't just heard someone vomit outside your door. The keeper, whether male or female, and there were plenty of women tavern keepers, the host was the anchor of the place. They brewed or bought the ale, kept the fire going, stocked the food, and made sure the benches didn't collapse beneath their guests. They were part businessperson, part gossip, and part peacekeeper. If you owed the keeper money, they remembered. If you got into a fight, they decided whether you were worth throwing out or worth another drink to calm you down. And if you were new in town, the keeper knew exactly how much to charge you without saying so out loud. Tavern keepers lived by a simple truth. The more you drank, the better you thought the service was. But they also knew how quickly a good night could turn into a disaster. The brewer. Some taverns brewed their own ale on site, and here the brewer was king or queen of the back room. Ale wasn't just alcohol. It was liquid bread, safer to drink than water, and a source of daily calories. Brewing was part science, part guesswork, and entirely bound to the season. The brewer had to balance malt, yeast, and water while avoiding contamination, which could turn a promising batch into something that tasted like wet hay and regret. When the ale was good, the tavern thrived. When it was bad, customers remembered, and they would walk an extra mile to drink somewhere else. The cook. Tavern food was not the fine fare of noble kitchens, but it had its own charm. Thick stews, fresh bread, pies stuffed with whatever was cheapest that week, all designed to keep you drinking longer. The cook was the quiet workhorse, turning limited ingredients into something edible, if not exactly memorable. If you complained, they didn't argue. They simply served you more bread, because bread made everything more filling and less questionable. The serving staff. Serving in a medieval tavern required quick feet, a steady grip, and the patience of a saint. You had to navigate crowded rooms, dodge grasping hands, and keep a smile, or at least a neutral face, while balancing 3 mugs of ale in one hand. Tips weren't a thing in the modern sense. Your reward was avoiding being blamed when someone spilled their own drink. Serving staff often doubled as entertainers, singing a verse here, telling a joke there, and keeping customers just happy enough to order another round. The regulars. Every tavern had them, the same faces in the same seats night after night. The keeper knew their habit. The brewer knew their preferences. They were the unofficial furniture, as reliable as the benches, though often louder. Regulars kept the place afloat in lean times. They also spread the tavern's reputation for better or worse. If they liked the place, they brought friends. If they didn't, word traveled faster than a spilt mug. The travelers. Then there were the strangers, merchants, pilgrims, wandering laborers, and the occasional performer. They brought stories, coin, and a touch of unpredictability. Travelers often paid more for food and drink than locals, partly because they didn't know the going rate, and partly because the keeper saw no reason to offer a discount to someone they might never see again. Suppliers and quiet allies. Behind the scenes was a small network that kept the tavern running. The miller who sold malted grain, the cooper who made barrels to store ale, the baker who supplied bread when the tavern oven was cold. These were not glamorous connections, but they were essential. Lose your supplier and you risked losing your business. The keeper's balancing act. Running a tavern meant managing all these people, staff, customers, and suppliers, while keeping the sheriff happy and the church only mildly suspicious. Too much drunken disorder could lead to fines or closure. Too little excitement and customers went elsewhere. The best tavern keepers knew exactly how far to let a night go before stepping in. They were part host, part referee, and part quiet manipulator, making sure the evening ended in laughter instead of broken teeth. In the next section, we'll follow the tavern's connection to the outside world, how news, rumors, and even politics found their way in with every traveler who stepped through the door. Because a medieval tavern wasn't just a place to drink, it was the unofficial news network of its time. If a medieval tavern had one unshakable purpose beyond selling ale, it was this. It was where news traveled, not official proclamations from the king. Those were read aloud in town squares by men who pretended not to mind being heckled, but the kind of news that mattered to ordinary people. The personal, the scandalous, the possibly made up. The arrival of a stranger. The moment the door creaked open and a new face appeared, the room noticed. Travelers carried information the way bees carried pollen, brushing past villages and leaving bits of gossip in their wake. They didn't always mean to, but if you asked the right questions and refilled their mug at the right moment, they would tell you things that had no business crossing so many miles. A passing merchant might casually mention a failed harvest 2 towns over. A soldier on leave could hint at troop movements without realizing it. A pilgrim, weary and footsore, might mutter about some strange illness spreading in the ports. In a world without printing presses for the masses, without newspapers on every corner, these tavern whispers were the news. And the truth? Accuracy was optional. How rumors grew legs. Rumors were a tavern's true currency. They could begin with something harmless. The lord's nephew was seen leaving a baker's shop at night, and by the time they reached the next table, the nephew was running away with the baker's daughter, the family silver, and possibly a goat. You might hear about a man who had drowned in the river. By the end of the week, he had been murdered, robbed, and his ghost had been spotted demanding vengeance. The more dramatic the story, the faster it traveled. People didn't mind if the details shifted. In fact, they preferred it. The truth was a bit like stale bread, hard to chew and not nearly as satisfying as a steaming loaf fresh from the oven. Politics in ale-stained corners. Though taverns were not official halls of power, they were where politics slipped off its formal cloak and sat down for a drink. Here, locals argued about taxes, debated whether the lord's latest decree was idiotic or merely inconvenient, and speculated about the competence of whoever was running things in the capital. Political talk was dangerous in the wrong company. Say too much against the wrong figure, and you might find yourself answering awkward questions from the sheriff. The wise learned to speak in hints and half-jokes, things you could deny later if necessary. But in the right company, with enough ale, the tavern became a parliament of the common people. It was where grievances were aired, alliances formed, and occasionally, minor rebellions quietly plotted. The role of the keeper in the rumor trade. The tavern keeper wasn't just a seller of ale. They were the master curator of information. They overheard everything. They knew who was cheating on whom, which debts weren't being paid, and which missing pig had actually been roasted last week in someone's kitchen. A good keeper never spread information recklessly. They traded it. Tell the right story to the right person, and you might get cheaper grain from the miller. Hold back a piece of gossip, and you might protect a friend or keep a customer from vanishing out of embarrassment. In a way, the keeper was both the news editor and the archive of the community's unofficial history. Songs as story carriers. Then there were the minstrels, the wandering news anchors of the Middle Ages. They sang ballads of local heroes, told tales of foreign lands, and slipped recent events into their verses so seamlessly that you could be humming about a tavern brawl in Bristol before realizing it had only happened last week. A good song was like a rumor you could whistle. It traveled faster than the truth, was harder to forget, and could turn a nameless peasant into a minor legend in the time it took to finish a chorus. The suspicious listener. Of course, not everyone in the tavern was there to drink or sing. Sometimes a man in the corner wasn't just a quiet patron. He was listening, perhaps for the church, perhaps for the local lord, or perhaps for coin from anyone willing to pay. The presence of such ears was why clever patrons never told a story in exactly the same way twice. A detail added here, a detail dropped there, a kind of verbal camouflage. The unwritten rule. The tavern's unwritten law was simple. What you heard here was yours to believe, to doubt, or to carry on, but never to blame on the source. No one admitted to starting a rumor. No one insisted too hard that something was true. And no one, no matter how curious, asked how a stranger knew quite so much about the Lord's private habit. In the next section, we'll step away from words and look at the physical life of the tavern, the architecture, the smells, the heat or lack of it, and the oddly important role of the hearth in making sure the night's conversations didn't freeze along with the guests. If the tavern was the heart of medieval village life, then the hearth was the heart of the tavern. It was more than a place to cook stew or warm ale. It was a glowing declaration that the cold outside could be kept at bay, at least for a few hours. Without it, the air would be as still and miserable as the frost-bitten lanes beyond the door. The hearth as centerpiece. Most taverns were not designed with comfort in mind. They were built for durability. Timber frames, wattle and daub walls, thatched or shingled roofs, not for keeping out drafts. The hearth made up for this architectural indifference by being the single reliable source of heat and light. Positioned either against one wall or in the center of the main room, the fire was rarely allowed to die. A dead hearth meant a cold tavern, and a cold tavern meant customers would drink faster and leave sooner, a financial disaster. The keeper or a serving boy would occasionally toss on a new log, sending up a shower of sparks. The flames would crackle, smoke curling toward the rafters where it would linger, darkening the beams over decades until they looked as though they'd been carved from midnight itself. The light it cast. Candlelight was expensive, tallow candles stank, beeswax was a luxury, so the hearth provided most of the illumination. It wasn't the even, gentle light of modern bulbs. It flickered, it shifted, it made shadows stretch across the walls like long-armed gossipers. You couldn't quite trust what you saw in that glow. A face might seem familiar from one angle and completely strange from another. Perhaps that was part of the appeal, a certain hazy anonymity in which people could say more than they might in the clear light of day. The smell of the place. Every tavern had its own signature smell, though pleasant might not be the right word. First, there was the smoke. Not the delicate scent of a wood-burning stove, but a thick, slightly bitter tang that clung to your clothing and hair. Then came the overlapping aromas of ale, sweat, and roasted meat, each competing for dominance. If there had been fish stew on the fire earlier, you'd know it. And beneath it all, there was always the faint dampness of wet wool. The coats of travelers hung near the fire to dry, steaming quietly like reluctant vegetables. The mixture was not exactly appetizing, but it was comforting, in the way that a familiar old blanket might be, even if it smelled faintly of the dog. The sounds beneath the roar. The hearth wasn't just visual, it was audible. The pop of resin pockets in the wood, the low hiss of sap, the sudden crack of a splitting log, these were part of the tavern's soundtrack. Around it, mugs clinked, benches scraped, and conversations rose and fell in uneven waves. From time to time, there would be a burst of laughter from one corner, or the rhythmic thump of a fist driving home a point on the table. Over all of it, the fire kept its steady voice, a reminder that the night could be long and the cold outside patient. Heat as social currency. Proximity to the fire was not a casual matter. The best seats were closest to the warmth, and if you arrived late, you would find yourself shivering near the door, nursing your ale with frozen fingers. Regulars had their preferred spots, a low bench along the hearth wall, perhaps, or a sturdy stool angled just so to catch the heat on one side while leaving the other cool enough to be comfortable. If you wanted a prime seat, you either had to be early, well-liked, or prepared to share your bench with someone whose elbows had their own social agenda. Cooking in the open. A tavern hearth wasn't just for heat, it was also the kitchen. Iron pots hung over the flames, suspended by blackened chains. Some contained simple fare, a barley pottage thick enough to stand a spoon in, or a stew of whatever meat had been available that week. Bread might be toasting on a long-handled peel, turning slowly so it wouldn't burn. Cheese could be warming on a flat stone near the coals, softening into a gooey indulgence. If the tavern was particularly well-stocked, the smell of spiced wine might drift through the air, an extravagant treat and a sure way to coax extra coin from customers. The hearth as a confessional. There was something about the fire's glow that loosened tongues. Perhaps it was the warmth after a long, cold day, or perhaps it was the hypnotic movement of the flames. Whatever the cause, people spoke more freely here, telling stories, revealing plans, confessing worries they would never dare voice in daylight. Some conversations stayed between friends. Others traveled, just like the sparks that drifted upward and vanished into the beams. The fire's last watch. As the night wound down and patrons stumbled out into the dark, the keeper would bank the fire, pushing the coals together, covering them with ash to preserve their heat until morning. It was both a practical step and a symbolic one, the tavern's pulse slowing, preparing for another day. And in the dim red glow, the empty benches and mugs seemed to hold the ghosts of the evening, the laughter, the arguments, the songs half forgotten but still hanging in the smoke. In the next section, we'll leave the warmth of the hearth and step into the cold medieval streets after closing, where the night belonged to thieves, animals, and people who preferred their business unseen. The tavern door closes with a dull wooden thud. Inside, the embers glow quietly, but outside, the night is wide and indifferent. It doesn't care how warm you were by the fire or how many mugs of ale you've had. The cold will greet you like an old acquaintance, familiar and unkind. The darkness of a medieval night. We forget, in our age of street lamps and neon, just how complete the medieval dark could be. When the sun dipped behind the horizon, it was as if the world was erased, leaving only shadows and the vaguest outline of what you thought you knew. The moon was your friend on clear nights, its pale light turning cobbles silver and rooftops to jagged silhouettes. But when clouds rolled in, the dark became almost tangible, something you could reach out and touch, though it might just as easily reach back. Streets made for day, not night. Medieval streets weren't designed for nocturnal strolls. They were narrow, uneven, and lined with buildings that leaned toward each other like conspirators. The air carried the mingled sense of smoke, damp earth, and the day's refuse, chamber pots emptied into gutters, where the contents drifted slowly toward some unseen low point. The noise of the tavern still clung faintly to your ears, but out here, sound traveled differently. A footstep behind you might be your neighbor heading home, or it might not. Those who owned the night. Not everyone feared the dark. Some people belonged to it. Thieves found night to be a loyal accomplice, one who never asked for a cut of the profit. Cats, both domestic and feral, prowled silently, slipping between shadows in search of scraps. Dogs, less subtle, barked at nothing and everything. And there were others, the night watch, whose job was to walk the streets with lanterns and staves, though their presence was more symbolic than preventative. If trouble found you, the watch might arrive in time to help, or in time to make a note of what had happened. Light as a rare commodity. Lanterns and torches were expensive to keep lit, so most people made do without. If you could afford a candle, you might shield it with your hand as you walked, the little flame sputtering in the breeze. But candles advertised two things, that you could afford one, and that you might be worth following. Most preferred to walk in darkness, trusting their feet to remember the road better than their eyes could see it. Sound as your guide. In the absence of light, sound took on a sharper edge. The slap of shoes on wet stones told you someone was hurrying. The slow drag of feet suggested someone too tired or too drunk to care. A sudden rustle might be a rat nosing through rubbish, or something larger. From an open shutter, a voice might spill into the street. A lullaby, a prayer, or a quiet argument carried in low, hissing tones. Even the wind seemed louder at night, curling around corners and rattling loose shutters like a restless hand at a door. The vulnerability of the journey. If you had to walk far after leaving a tavern, you did it with a certain awareness. Every shadow seemed deeper, every alley a possible hiding place. The drunken confidence you had indoors evaporated quickly in the open air. People often traveled home in pairs or groups, their conversations hushed not by caution, but by the instinct that loud voices might carry too far. In some places, a curfew bell marked the hour when the wise stayed inside, but tavern patrons often missed that cue entirely. Unexpected encounters. The night had a way of introducing you to people you'd never meet in daylight. A merchant's apprentice running a late errand, a midwife summoned to a birth, a figure carrying a sack whose contents you might prefer not to know. Some encounters were fleeting, a nod, a muttered greeting, while others lingered too long to be comfortable. And there was always the possibility of meeting someone you knew from the tavern earlier, now less cheerful and more inclined to settle a score. Animals of the night. Domestic animals took on a different character after dark. Cats were bolder, dogs more suspicious. Horses in stables stamped and shifted restlessly, unsettled by distant sounds their owners would never hear. Rats, of course, ruled the alleys without question, their tiny claws clicking on the stones as they darted between shadows. Sometimes you saw their eyes first, glinting briefly before disappearing into the dark. The long walk home. The journey from tavern to home could feel much longer than it had in the other direction. Ale slowed your steps and dulled your balance, but the cold kept you awake enough to regret leaving the fire. Houses were unlit, their doors bolted, windows shuttered tight against the night. It was not a world that welcomed lingering. When you finally reached your door, the relief was not just physical but psychological. You were back in your own space, whatever its flaws, with the night kept firmly on the other side of the wood. There's something about a medieval tavern that makes you think it's all noise and movement, clinking mugs, bursts of laughter, the uneven shuffle of feet on warped floorboards. But stay long enough, and you'll realize there are always one or two figures who don't join the noise. They don't shout over the din, they don't throw dice with the merchants, and they certainly don't stumble toward the ale barrel with a glazed look. They're still, almost too still, the quiet watchers of the room. They weren't always in the shadows, like some imagined spy from a cheap play. Shadows are suspicious. Shadows are obvious. The best watcher stood in plain sight, maybe near the doorway where the wind carried in smells of horses and wet earth, or leaning casually against a wall just close enough to the hearth to keep warm without being drawn into conversation. They didn't need to hide, because people don't notice stillness. Not when there are storytellers gesturing wildly, or drunk patrons swaying in time with songs half-remembered from the harvest. The watcher might have been the tavern owner's cousin, entrusted with keeping an eye out in exchange for a meal and a few coins. Or maybe they were a retired soldier who found standing in a corner far easier than working in the fields. Some were simply locals who had made the tavern their unofficial post, and no one dared to challenge it. They could read a room like a priest reading scripture, slow, deliberate, word by word. You'd be surprised how much there was to read. The sudden pause in a conversation when a stranger approached. The narrowing of eyes between two farmers who once disputed a boundary line. The subtle handoff of something small, too quick for most to see, but not too quick for them. And it wasn't just conflict they noticed. They remembered faces, gestures, the small tells of human nature. If you came in with one person and left with another, they'd store it away. If you drank heavily 3 nights in a row, they'd note that too. In a medieval town, where gossip spread faster than the plague, these observations were valuable currency. And the watchers' loyalties? Those were the real mystery. They might have been keeping the peace for the tavern keeper, but just as easily they could have been the eyes of the local lord, or the town reeve, or a merchant with a vested interest in who was drinking with whom. Rival taverns sometimes hired watchers to learn the tricks of the competition, what songs kept people drinking, which patrons could be lured away with cheaper ale. And in the darker corners of history, there were watchers who served the church, sent to monitor who kept company with suspected heretics. This was an age without locks on every door, without written records for every conversation, without photographs or signatures. The watcher was the walking memory of the tavern. And the unsettling thing was, you could be entirely unaware they were watching you. They weren't glaring or scowling like some heavy-handed guard. They were calm, patient, maybe even smiling faintly, as if amused by a private joke. You might think them a daydreamer, lost in their own thoughts, until the moment a chair scraped sharply across the floor, or a voice rose in anger, and they were moving before anyone else had even turned their head. They didn't have uniforms. There were no shining badges or bright belts to set them apart. The only clue was in how people reacted to them. Patrons shifted slightly when the watcher passed, giving them space without seeming to notice they'd done it. Troublemakers would glance at them and then think better of whatever they had planned. The regulars might greet them politely but never linger in conversation. Everyone knew, on some instinctive level, what their role was. Of course, not every watcher was a figure of quiet authority. Some were barely interested in the work at all. They stood their post because it paid or because it was warmer inside than out. They might spend long stretches staring into the fire, eyes half-lidded, or following the rim of a mug with a fingertip as if tracing a map. But even the laziest watcher could surprise you. A commotion could snap them into sudden, precise movement, slipping between stools, catching a drunkard before he fell, or planting themselves in the space between two shouting men until the heat of the argument died down. If you were a stranger in the tavern, you might notice them after an hour or two. At first, they'd blend in, a face in the background. Then you'd realize something about them didn't change. They didn't sway with the rhythm of the crowd, didn't raise their voice, didn't lose their footing on the uneven floor. They were the one constant in a sea of motion. And once you noticed, you might start to wonder, had they been watching you all along? Tracking how quickly you drank, who you spoke to, whether you kept your coin purse close or carelessly left it on the table. You'd start replaying your own movements in your head, searching for some moment you wished you'd handled differently. And the watcher? They'd simply keep watching, making no sign they'd noticed your sudden self-consciousness. Some taverns had more than one. A pair of watchers could work in a subtle dance, one posted by the door, the other drifting near the far wall, catching the other's glance across the room when something needed attention. No words passed between them, no gestures even, just a kind of shared awareness built from long nights of standing in the same space, seeing the same people, noting the same patterns. And then there were the ones who didn't seem like watchers at all until it was too late. Maybe you thought they were another drinker, sitting alone with a mug, nursing it for hours. Then a fight broke out and they were suddenly on their feet, moving with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. These watchers were the trickiest because they let you forget they were there, until you couldn't. A medieval tavern wasn't just a place to drink. It was a place where business was conducted, reputations were made and broken, and secrets were traded in plain sight. And for every open, boisterous exchange, there was someone watching silently, recording the moment without quill or parchment. In an age where memory was sometimes the only record, that was power. If you were wise, you didn't try to outsmart the watcher. You kept your voice calm, your coins in sight, your company familiar. You remembered that even the warmest, most welcoming tavern was not truly private. And as you drained your mug and prepared to leave, you might feel a set of eyes follow you to the door. Not hostile, not friendly, just there. The quiet watcher would stay behind, leaning against the wall as the door shut and the cold air faded. They would keep watching, as they always had, because in the strange little ecosystem of the medieval tavern, someone always had to. If the tavern's drink list was a gamble, the food menu was the full medieval lottery, except there were no winning tickets, and the jackpot was not being sick by morning. Eating in a medieval tavern was less about delighting your taste buds and more about testing your body's resilience to whatever had been simmering in a pot for an indeterminate number of days. Menus didn't exist in the way we think of them. You didn't walk in, sit down, and have a cheerful server hand you a parchment scroll detailing your options. No, your options were whatever happened to be bubbling in the kitchen cauldron, a mixture of yesterday's leftovers, today's questionable contributions, and, if you were unlucky, tomorrow's regrets. This stew was called pottage, and it was the workhorse of medieval cuisine. Pottage could be thick, hearty, and genuinely nourishing, or thin, watery, and suspiciously gritty, depending on the cook's skill and the availability of ingredients. Grains, root vegetables, bits of salted meat, and herbs might be thrown in if the cook was feeling generous. On poorer days, it was just barley, cabbage, and the faint memory of pork. And here's the thing, no two bowls of pottage were ever quite the same. That's because the cauldron was never emptied, ever. It just kept simmering day and night, with new ingredients being added whenever someone thought of it. This created what food historians call a perpetual stew, and what anyone with modern hygiene standards might call culinary Russian roulette. If the tavern had bread to go with it, you were in luck, sort of. Bread was the backbone of the medieval diet, but the quality varied wildly. Wealthier patrons might enjoy loaves made with fine, sifted wheat flour, soft, pale, and almost fluffy. The average tavern-goer, however, got maslin, a coarse bread made from a mix of rye, barley, and wheat, sometimes with peas or beans ground in to stretch the dough. It was dense enough to double as a doorstop and had a shelf life measured in weeks, if not months. And then there was trench bread, thick slabs of stale loaf used as edible plates. The stew would be ladled directly onto the bread, soaking in all the juices. After the meal, you could eat your plate, or, if you were wealthy enough not to need it, toss it to the dogs or the poor waiting outside. Yes, your discarded tableware was someone else's dinner. Occasionally, you might be served meat that wasn't boiled beyond recognition. Roasted fowl, sausages, or salted pork might appear on the tavern table, especially if a local hunt had been good. But unless you were in a bustling market town with access to fresh produce, vegetables were an afterthought, and fruit, when available, was usually cooked into pies or stews to keep it from spoiling. Speaking of pies, these were not always the delicate pastry treats we think of today. The medieval pie crust, called a coffin, was hard, thick, and inedible, meant to serve as a cooking vessel and storage container. Kept the filling safe from the elements but wasn't really meant to be eaten. Of course, hungry tavern-goers sometimes gnawed on it anyway, especially after a few mugs of ale lowered their culinary standard. Then there was fish. If you happened to visit the tavern on a fasting day, which, thanks to the church calendar, happened a lot, you might be served salted herring, dried cod, or, if you were very unlucky, something called stockfish. Stockfish was essentially rock-hard dried fish that had to be beaten with a mallet before cooking. It was less dinner and more an act of penance disguised as protein. Seasonings were a mixed blessing. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and saffron were prized, expensive imports, so if you tasted them in your food, It meant the tavern owner either had deep pockets or knew how to water down the flavor just enough to stretch the supply. More often, local herbs like parsley, sage, and mustard seed were used. Salt was precious enough to be locked away like treasure, which meant your stew might be bland one day and aggressively salted the next, depending on the cook's mood. Of course, medieval cooks had their own tricks for hiding the taste of meat that had gone questionable. Heavy use of spices, vinegar, and honey could transform something on the brink of decay into something almost pleasant. The less you asked about the provenance of your meal, the better you slept. Food wasn't just eaten, it was shared. In most taverns, you sat at long communal tables, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, tearing bread with your hands and dipping it into shared bowls. Individual plates and utensils were rare. Knives were personal belongings you brought with you, and spoons were often shared. Forks? Those were suspicious foreign inventions that hadn't yet found their way into common use. Eating was an intimate, sometimes chaotic experience, full of elbows, spilled ale, and the occasional argument over whose turn it was to get the meaty bit from the pot. For travelers, the tavern meal was often the first real food they'd had in days, so they approached it with an appetite strong enough to overlook imperfections. For locals, it was as much about the company as the cuisine, a chance to gossip, to bargain, to flirt, or to listen to a traveling bard sing about heroes and tragedies while you tried not to get stew on your tunic. And here's the quiet truth. For all the hazards of medieval dining, the tavern table was a place of connection. Bread passed from hand to hand, laughter echoing over the clatter of cups, strangers becoming friends over a shared dish. The food may not have been fine, but it was warm, and in a world of cold stone and colder nights, warmth was worth more than taste. As the night wore on, the cauldron continued to bubble, the bread supply slowly dwindled, and the floor grew sticky with spilled ale. Dogs curled under the benches, waiting for scraps, while the last patrons lingered over their bowls, reluctant to leave the glow of the fire for the chill outside. When you finally pushed your empty trencher away and wiped your hands on whatever rag passed for a napkin, you weren't just leaving a tavern. You were stepping back into a world that was darker, colder, and far less forgiving than the noisy, smoky haven you just enjoyed. And maybe, just maybe, you'd come back tomorrow for another ladle of whatever was in that pot. Not because it was delicious, but because it was there, and in the Middle Ages that was reason enough. If you wandered through the muddy lanes of a medieval town, past the butchers with their dangling cuts of meat and the market women shouting over turnips, you might eventually stumble upon a doorway framed by something odd. A long pole with a bundle of twigs or a cloth tied to the end, hanging out like a strange medieval flag. This was not, as a modern mind might hope, a sign for a quaint little coffee shop. No, this was the ale stake, the universal symbol that fresh ale was ready, brewed not in a grand brewery, but right here in someone's home. And more often than not, that someone was a woman. These women, known as ale wives, were the beating heart of local tavern culture before taverns even existed in their modern sense. They weren't just pouring drinks, they were brewing the very ale that fueled peasants, laborers, and wandering minstrels alike. This wasn't a dainty job. Brewing ale in the Middle Ages meant hauling buckets of water, sometimes from quite a distance, and stirring vats of grain mash in the heat and steam of a hearth. And if that sounds rustic and charming, remember, water was a fickle friend. Too cold, and your yeast sulked in silence. Too hot, and you'd kill it entirely. Ale wives had to judge these things by hand, by eye, and sometimes by sheer instinct, because thermometers would not enter the scene for centuries. Ale was the drink of the people, low in alcohol, rich in calories, and safe compared to water that could very easily send you to meet your maker. So these women weren't merely brewers, they were lifelines. Their skill meant a whole neighborhood had something nourishing and mildly intoxicating to sip after a day in the fields or at the loom. And yet, despite their importance, the ale wives became the target of some of the most vicious public ridicule in medieval society. Perhaps it was because ale brewing was tied to the domestic sphere, and anything women did at home was often dismissed as lesser work. Or perhaps it was because success drew attention, and attention drew suspicion. By the late Middle Ages, an unfortunate number of alewives were caricatured in plays, poems, and woodcuts as dishonest cheats, watering down their ale, using bad grain, or serving it in filthy cups. Whether these accusations were rooted in truth or simply in the joy of mocking women who made money is open for debate. Some historians note, rather darkly, that the imagery used to shame alewives would later become tangled with early witch stereotypes. Tall hats, broom-like ale stakes, and cats that kept the grain stores safe from mice. These were the real tools of their trade. But over time, they merged in the public imagination with tales of sorcery. The truth is more mundane, yet far more interesting. The tall hat simply made them visible in a crowd, the ale stake signaled fresh brew, and the cat was an employee paid in leftover milk. If you walked into an alewife's tavern, and that word is used loosely here, because many were just front rooms of houses, you'd likely find a mix of people huddled over wooden cups. There would be workers fresh from the fields, their hands still rough with soil. There might be traveling peddlers telling wild stories in exchange for drink. And in the corner, someone might be playing a crude flute or tapping a rhythm on the table, because music has a way of sneaking in wherever alcohol is found. The alewife herself might be bustling about, topping off cups and swapping gossip, all while keeping a sharp eye on who was paying and who was trying to forget. Prices were set by local custom, but the law kept an eye on things, too. In some towns, aleconers, official ale testers, would wander in, taste the brew, and declare whether it met the standard. If it didn't, fines were issued. Imagine being mid-pour when an aleconer showed up, dipped a ladle into your vat, sipped, and either nodded approvingly or told you that your work was unfit for human consumption. Alewives were businesswomen in a world that often didn't want women to have visible economic power. Some made enough to keep their families fed and clothed. Others struggled, accused by competitors or harassed by authorities for brewing without the right permissions. But all of them existed in a strange middle space, essential to daily life, yet rarely given the dignity that came with other trades. There's something striking about imagining them late at night, when the customers had gone, the cups were washed in whatever passed for clean water, and the fire was banked low. Maybe they sat for a moment in the quiet, savoring the last cup from the day's brew, letting the yeast-scented warmth fill the air. Outside, the streets might still echo with the stumbling feet of those they had served, heading home in the dark. And in that moment, the alewife had done her job, not just pouring drink, but sustaining the rhythm of the town itself. Because in the end, medieval tavern life wasn't just about the drink. It was about the people who made it possible, often without fanfare, standing in smoky rooms with their aprons damp, brewing a small measure of comfort into every wooden cup. And in that way, the alewives were as much the keepers of community as any lord in his hall, just with fewer tapestries, more spilled ale, and the occasional cat prowling underfoot. If you think the medieval tavern was just about drinking, then you have underestimated humanity's ability to turn any space into a complex web of unspoken rules, rivalries, and subtle performances. Because as much as ale kept the medieval world hydrated, the tavern kept it socially lubricated. It wasn't just a place to drink, it was a theater of human behavior, one without scripts but with plenty of recurring characters. Let's begin with the first and most obvious rule. Where you sat mattered. Walk into a medieval alehouse and you'd see long, rough-hewn tables, sometimes little more than planks balanced on barrels. The regulars had their spots. A man might spend half the evening nursing one cup simply to hold his place in the corner by the hearth. The hearth meant warmth, and warmth meant power. The unspoken privilege of overhearing every whispered plot, gossip, and insult without straining your ears. Strangers who sat too close to the hearth without invitation were met with cold eyes, which was impressive given the warmth of the fire. The next layer of code was about the drink itself. Ordering the good stuff wasn't as simple as reading a menu. Menus weren't a thing yet. You had to know who was brewing that week, what barrel had just been tapped, and whether the ale was at its prime or already sliding into that tangy, sour stage. If you were unlucky enough to receive a cup from the bottom of the barrel, with floating bits of grain or the occasional unexpected lump, you did not complain loudly, unless you wanted to start a brawl. Instead, you quietly ordered another, hoping for better luck. Speaking of brawls, they were both feared and expected. Medieval taverns had an odd rhythm. Hours of subdued chatter could be interrupted suddenly by a shouting match over an unpaid debt, a disputed card game, or someone daring to insult another man's boots. These scuffles could escalate quickly, but they rarely spiraled into true chaos, partly because even drunk people knew that breaking the ale bench meant everyone stood for the rest of the night, which was a fate worse than a black eye. The tavern was also a place where people performed themselves, sometimes quite literally. Minstrels and wandering storytellers would drift in, bringing with them not just news from far-off towns, but entertainment. They might sing ballads about noble knights or, more dangerously, satirical verses about local officials. Everyone laughed, unless the official in question happened to be sitting 3 feet away, in which case the laughter got quieter, and the minstrel began eyeing the door. Then there were the unofficial services provided in certain corners of the tavern. A man could find someone to sharpen his blade, mend a torn jerkin, or discreetly introduce him to someone selling goods of uncertain origin. Taverns, after all, were hubs of both legitimate trade and the kind of business you didn't record in parish ledgers. Smugglers liked them for the same reason everyone else did. Noise covered a lot of conversations. Women in taverns were a more complicated matter. In many towns, they were welcome as customers. In others, their presence was automatically tied to sex work in the eyes of the authorities, whether or not that was true. Some alewives hosted their own brew halls and ruled over them like queens, sharp-tongued, quick-witted, and entirely uninterested in putting up with troublemakers. A few became legendary in local folklore for their verbal duels with drunk patrons, often leaving the men red-faced without having to lift a hand. Money, of course, had its own etiquette. Paying up front was safest, but if you were a known regular, you could run a tab, the medieval equivalent of trust. Fail to settle it by the week's end, though, and you might find yourself barred, which was a sort of social exile. Being turned away from the tavern didn't just mean no ale. It meant missing the heartbeat of the town, the place where marriages were arranged, work was found, and news of impending taxes trickled down before official proclamations. And then there were the toasts. These were not the neat, standing speeches of a wedding reception. They were loud, messy, often improvised declarations, blessings for good harvests, curses for rival villages, oaths of brotherhood sealed over sloshing cups. Toasts could be rallying cries or thinly veiled insults, depending on the company. The danger was that once someone began, the toasting could spiral, each man trying to outdo the last until everyone had drunk more than they planned. Not all tavern life was rough edges and shouting. In quieter moments, the atmosphere could be strangely domestic. The scent of wood smoke, yeast, and herbs drifted through the air. Someone might be carving a piece of wood by candlelight while listening to a neighbor describe a fishing trip. A young apprentice might nervously flirt with the brewer's daughter, pretending he wasn't glancing at her every other sentence. The tavern was as much a backdrop for these small human dramas as it was a venue for loud, drunken nights. The church, predictably, had opinions about taverns, most of them negative. Clerics preached against drunkenness, gambling, and the moral decay supposedly bred in alehouses. And yet, even the most pious communities couldn't do without them entirely. After all, ale was safer than water, and a place where townsfolk could meet indoors without freezing was as much a necessity as a luxury. So the church frowned, the people drank, and the world spun on. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval tavern culture is how it blurred the lines between classes, but only up to a point. A wealthy merchant might share a bench with a poor farmer, united in their love of good ale, but social hierarchies still found ways to reassert themselves. The merchant's cup might be pewter while the farmer's was wood. The merchant might be served first, and while both laughed at the same jokes, they left through different doors in the morning, one to a townhouse, the other to a thatched cottage. Closing time, when it came, was a soft collapse rather than a sharp cutoff. The fire was allowed to die low, the last cups drained, the night air biting at the edges of the open doorway. Some patrons lingered outside to continue their conversations under the stars. Others stumbled home, guided by the flicker of lanterns and the smell of cooking fires in distant kitchens. Inside, the tavern keeper swept the floor, righted overturned benches, and stacked cups, ready to do it all again tomorrow. In the end, the medieval tavern was a mirror, sometimes flattering, sometimes brutally honest, of the society around it. It was a place where laughter and anger lived side by side, where a stranger could become a friend over the course of an evening, or an enemy in the space of a single careless word. And though centuries have passed, the essence of it remains. Modern bars and pubs still hold echoes of those old alehouses. The regulars with their unspoken seating rights, the toasts that start with sincerity and end in absurdity, the mingling of strangers who might, for a few hours, feel like part of the same small world. Because no matter the century, give people a warm room, a drink, and an audience, and they will write the same old play, one cup at a time. It is a curious thing the way a medieval tavern would fall quiet. Not in the way a modern cafe closes, lights switched off, chairs stacked neatly, and the faint hum of an espresso machine powering down. No, medieval quiet was different. It was heavier. It lingered like the smell of spilled ale and damp wool, sinking into the stone walls and wooden beams. The crowd would thin slowly, not in a polite exodus, but in stubborn dribbles. There was always that one man, hunched at the corner table, pretending he had not noticed the candles burning low, and that other, slouched in the corner bench, claiming to be just resting his eyes as his head lolled sideways. The tavern keeper would shuffle about, clattering mugs into a bucket, muttering with that peculiar mixture of fatigue and irritation known only to those who have spent hours serving people convinced they are charming when in fact they are deeply, tragically annoying. Some guests left in twos or threes, leaning on each other as though friendship were the only thing keeping them upright. They sang, if you could call it singing, half-remembered ballads about kings, loves lost, or, occasionally, inexplicable verses about geese. Out on the muddy street, the cold would hit them in the chest, and they'd pull their cloaks tighter, their breath steaming in the lantern light. And yet, even in their weaving steps, there was a strange comfort. They were full of warmth, liquid warmth mostly, but warmth all the same. Inside, the last embers in the hearth would pop softly, sending tiny bursts of light across the tavern's battered tables. A barmaid might wipe the last corner of the counter, her mind already drifting toward her own bed, a straw mattress in a loft above the kitchen, where the smell of smoke clung to the rafters and crept into dreams. The owner would close the shutters with a slow, deliberate push, as though sealing in not just the heat but the secrets traded within those walls. And there were secrets, deals struck over tankards, confessions blurted after the third jug, lovers' glances exchanged quickly before retreating into the safety of conversation. The tavern absorbed them all, keeping them tucked away like the sediment at the bottom of a cask. By now, the only sounds were the occasional clink of pottery, the settling of the fire, and the muffled wind beyond the door. Yet, if you stayed a moment longer, just long enough to let the room breathe, you might swear you could hear something else. The faintest traces of laughter, as though it were caught between the floorboards. A voice from earlier in the night, echoing strangely, almost like it was trying to repeat itself. Perhaps it was only your imagination, or perhaps, as many in those days believed, a tavern never truly emptied. Spirits, after all, were not always in the cup. Some said that if you lingered too long after closing, the air would shift, that the shadows in the corners would lengthen just slightly, and the smell of freshly poured ale would rise, though the barrels were tapped dry. There were whispers, always whispers, of a traveler who died in some forgotten brawl and still sat by the door, waiting for a drink that would never come. Or of a young serving girl, humming as she polished mugs, though her hands had been still for centuries. But then, superstition was as common in the Middle Ages as watered wine. People were used to the idea that the dead didn't always stay put, and perhaps in places like this, where joy and bitterness, love and anger, hunger and satisfaction all lived in the same air, it made sense that a few traces of the night refused to leave. Eventually, the door would be bolted. The tavern would sink into darkness, the only light now coming from the street beyond, where a lantern swayed gently in the wind. The warmth would fade. The smell of beer and sweat would hang, unbothered by time, and the building would stand, silent, until the next evening, when the door would creak open and the cycle begin again. New stories told, old stories repeated, and more laughter stored in the grain of the wood. A medieval tavern was more than just a place to drink. It was a place to be human, loudly, messily, unashamedly human. And in that way it was timeless. People today still seek the same thing, a place to gather, to share a meal or a drink, to feel less alone. The decor has changed. The floor might be cleaner. The menu no longer features questionable meat pies, but the heartbeat, that's the same. And so, as we close the shutters on tonight's little trip into the dim, smoky corners of medieval nightlife, imagine that sound again. The mug meeting the table, the fire crackling, the chorus of voices rising in uneven song. Imagine stepping out into the cold night air, cheeks flushed, head buzzing, and feeling, for just a moment, that you belong exactly where you are, that you've been part of something bigger than yourself. Then imagine the silence that follows, the way the street seems too big after the closeness of the tavern. Somewhere, in the distance, a bell tolls. Somewhere else, a door slams, and you walk away, carrying the warmth with you, until it fades, just enough to make you want to return. After all, every good night out, whether in the 14th century or the 21st, ends with the same quiet promise. Next time.